Hello. So my name is Stacey Sutton, and I'm an assistant professor of urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And on behalf of UIC's Social Justice Initiative and the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, IRPP, I want to welcome our guests, our panelists, and everyone watching. I'm very excited to be the moderator of this conversation, which we're calling Imagining and Demanding Economic Justice in the Time of Corona. And then I would add, and beyond, right? Because what we're really going to have a conversation about is, our current context, the current moment, and the urgency of now, but also, and perhaps in some ways, more importantly, how we're planning for a future beyond capitalism, beyond the conditions that we currently have. This is the second conversation in a series that is jointly hosted by IRPP and the Social Justice Initiative. And the intention of this series is to really explore the social and racial inequities that this pandemic highlights. And so as I moderate the conversation today, I really want to engage the broad concept of how collective action and the solidarity economy can help us address the immediate issues, as I said, related to the coronavirus, but also, and the pandemic, but also help us create this alternative economic future. There's a lot that we don't know about the future that we will soon be embarking on, but what we know is this. Currently, innumerable lives and livelihoods have been transformed by this pandemic. This is an epic tragedy, and it's still unfolding. So the true magnitude and devastation on our lives, our families, our communities is still not yet known. What we know is also this, that prior to this pandemic, millions of workers, many who we now call essential workers, grocery store cashiers, bus drivers, mail carriers, nursing aides, farm workers, meat processing, folks that work in meat processing, all of these folks, many of these folks, were living just one inadequate paycheck away from being unable to meet their basic needs for housing, healthcare, food, childcare, and so on. And a million more disenfranchised and marginalized workers couldn't depend on even that paycheck, right? These are folks that are working in homes as childcare providers, handymen and hustlers, gig contractors, sex workers, creatives. Many are disproportionately Black and Latinx communities. They're surviving on the margins of our economy, right? They're working within the informal economy, surviving on the margins of the formal economy, without institutional protections, without a government stimulus. What I think everyone on this panel knows, this pandemic has exposed the uncomfortable truths about the failure of capitalism, things that we've been talking about for generations. And it's also exposed the perniciousness of structural racism. So while there's a lot about our future that we don't know, and that is, the life beyond this pandemic, that so much still remains uncertain, we know that another economic trajectory is essential. And what I hope our panelists will engage, and they'll explain how elements of this alternative or new, but not so new economic justice, economic alternative is already being practiced in some of our communities. It's being practiced in Chicago, it's being practiced in Jackson, Mississippi, it's being practiced in Boston, Massachusetts, in communities across the United States and globally. I think the reason we've come together today is to share some of those examples. So as we talk about alternatives, I want folks to hold the idea that while they may be different from what you're used to, these are practices that are kind of deeply grounded in our history, and they've been successful thus far. The point is to really kind of expose more people to these possibilities. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you very briefly to the panelists, and they can then elaborate on themselves and their work. So first we have Kali Akuno, who's joining us from Jackson, Mississippi, where he is the co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson. And most recently, I would say that Cooperation Jackson called for a people's action on May Day, a demonstration on May Day, and they were demanding that corporations put people before profits, and I hope many of you participated in that action. Renee Hatcher, who is here at UIC, she's a professor, assistant professor of law, and the director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic at UIC John Marshall Law School. Hoda Katebi, a writer, a community organizer, a founding member of the Bhutan Production Cooperative. It's a global cooperative that happens to be located in Chicago. And it's also, I think she'll share more about it, but what I think is really important is that it's an all-women immigrant and refugee-run apparel manufacturer that is a worker cooperative. And we have a guest from Boston, Massachusetts, Penn Loh, where he has partnered with community organizations there, the Center for Economic Democracy and the Solidarity Economy, and he also directs the Masters in Public Policy program and Community Practice in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. Sorry. So I'm really excited to have both guests and other Chicagoans talk about what's happening so people can understand the possibilities before us. So what I'll do is just start with a general question, and then we'll go around again with some more specific questions. So the general question is this, and I'll start with Kali and go around. So well before the coronavirus pandemic, I know all of you have been working and organizing around economic justice, and arguably laying the foundation for a world beyond capitalism. So how do you describe, Kali, how do you describe economic justice in the work that you've been doing, and how does it do two things, both respond to the urgency of now, the epic tragedy that we're living through, but also and simultaneously kind of build a pathway for moving forward? So that's a question to everyone, but I'll start with Kali.
Well, first, let me say what's up to all the panelists. Good to see everybody. Hope everybody is doing well. Everybody's looking well. These days and times, that's encouraging to see. Second, thank everybody for tuning in and jumping in this conversation with us. I'll start with just our experience in process. One, it should be noted that at least in our design, we were designing Cooperation Jackson in part to deal with moments like these, to deal with crises like this. We had not exactly this crisis in mind, of course. Nobody could have predicted this particular crisis, although I think it should be worth saying that scientists have been warning about major epidemics similar to this for many years now, going back to the eruption of SARS, H1N1, Ebola. Because of the conditions of capitalism, particularly urban encroachment on a global scale, we know more of these are coming down the pipeline, and we need to get ready. But going in our in particular, we are veterans of Hurricane Katrina. So we had some experience with a natural catastrophe which turned into a systemic catastrophe because of the total ineptness of and unwillingness of government, which only exacerbated the situation, which really highlighted in our need, here in Mississippi, to draw deep on our own history around self-reliance and self-determination, to draw on our own resources in times of crisis, which for us is an ongoing one, which we'll talk about more. But that when it comes to saving our lives and protecting our interests, we have to be self-organized in moments of acute social breakdown, such as we're experiencing now. So we tried to draw our program up to deal with some fundamental basics, food, shelter, ability to make some basic goods and services that our community needs have been in the forefront of our planning and our work to address what we think are and unfortunately now bearing witness to crisis such as this. On the question around justice, I would say that first and foremost, it starts with being able to secure one's livelihood and life. And I'm putting that in the context of now because I think we are seeing for many in a way that they've never experienced how disposable we are to this system. Utterly, the words but I mean, they just don't care. If Black and brown and indigenous folks die, they just really don't care, and they feel that we can just be, cogged in and replaced. And it's really shaping, the injustice is really shaping the narrative that there's acceptable risk for the other side of this equation, which says that, if 2 or 3% of the population, begins to annually die from this, as long as it's certain populations, that's acceptable. And so justice means for us being able to protect ourselves and making sure we have the resources and institutions in place to be able to reflect ourselves, make sure we can feed and protect, clothe, and house our people first and foremost. So we've tried to break it down in some very material things. I'm going to try to highlight this in this particular conversation for reasons I think will become apparent a little bit more. But it doesn't fall short of us struggling for political change. And that is one of the reasons, I'll say that for later, but that's one of the reasons why we are calling for broad systemic change in the heels and face of this, because we know the right wing is using and is going to use this crisis to profoundly reorganize society and not in our best interest.
In terms of the work that I've mostly been trying to support, a lot of what I do is provide legal support to the solidarity economy in Chicago and also to some other national organizations. But, just in thinking about the work of kind of solidarity economy development and why it's so critical to this moment, it's hard to think of a better suited situation to expose all the ways in which capitalism has failed us, right? And to a certain extent, I think what's happening in this moment is that a lot of folks are waking up to what decades of disinvestment in the commons and public services and all the things that we actually need to sustain ourselves on a very basic level, right? I think all of that is now kind of laid at our feet in so many different ways, to disinvestment of public health, to our healthcare system, to obviously the persistence of racism through all of the various systems, right, that we have to interact with to live, to engage society. And so in that way, it feels like obviously a moment of crisis. I think that there's this tension, but there's also this moment of opportunity, right? So people are talking a lot now about the mutual aid that's happening, which has been happening for a very long time. I think it's more visible, right? A lot of the work that people have been doing in creating the institutions that they need to actually flourish in their communities, or communities obviously that have been completely abandoned by local, state, federal government in different ways, right? Have for a long time have been practicing solidarity economy in different ways, whether it be mutual aid, whether it be starting, worker co-ops where workers can actually own their own labor and not be exploited in the different ways in which we've seen. I think that also has become more apparent in the ways in which workers are exploited. in particular industries, and what as we start to think about like some solutions to some of that. So to me, I think that the COVID crisis has really exposed all of this. A lot of what all of us knew who've been doing this work, or just who have been paying attention and thinking about the choices that government makes, obviously that private actors make, right, is very apparent, right? And I think never before have we had to recognize, right, that there often is, that our current economic system, our current government in many ways has chosen economic growth over people's lives, right? And I think now it's the first time that people have actually put it in those stark terms, but that more or less has been something that has been happening by the choices that we have made as a society and how we have organized ourselves both economically and also the way in which capitalism has overtaken democracy in terms of who ultimately has voice, who has access, but also who receives a lot of the benefits of the system, right? And the way in which benefits and burdens are laid bare, I think it's very clear that certainly service workers who are majority Black, Latinx are devalued, and never before has it been so clear that the government is of that mindset. On the other side of it, I think, is that, there's a lot of, for folks on the ground, it's never become as clear that we need to keep doing what we're doing and building our own institutions that we control that actually address the things that we need, as Kali was saying, in terms of what folks have been doing here around mutual aid, making sure that folks have access to food, and also just a lot of the community organizations, a lot of the folks who are based in community, just trying to also be intent on what they have to offer and make sure that they're kind of engaging in ways that can actually help people through this period. So I think, again, this is a moment of opportunity, really, even though as the urgency and then people are really hurting quite bad, right? That we really need to get serious about transforming our economic system and think about some of the structural opportunities that we can take advantage both now, but also coming out of this crisis, right? And the fact that we cannot go back to the way things were. And so how do we leverage this moment in ways that can start to at least transform the building blocks of our economy? How do we transform the political economy to obviously address pervasive racism and really the devaluing of life that the economic system has done for so long?
Perfect, thank you. Same question to Penn. How the here and now in your work and the future, how are you engaging those?
Thanks, Stacey. And again, a pleasure to be here and be in relationship with all of you. Actually had a whole trip to Chicago planned to visit you all in person that had to be postponed because of this crisis. But I want to say I come out of the environmental justice movement from the early 90s, and I think we always knew that in our fight against environmental racism and disproportionate burdens, it was always requiring the transformation of the systems that were producing those burdens. And that, like Kali said, whole communities, our peoples were basically seen as expendable, right? It was okay to sacrifice them for the sake of economic growth. So the long game has always been to figure out how we can build towards a more sustainable, just, and democratic world. And that's why a lot of the work that, we've been involved with partners here in Boston, we were not just trying to clean up the toxic sites, but we were trying to build community control over development, right? When the green jobs stuff really came in, we were saying, we don't want just any green jobs. We don't want those that exploit our people in the name of sustainability. We want to develop strategies so we can own and control a green economy. And so the work that I have been involved with, the Center for Economic Democracy, for the last 10 or so years, we've been doing a lot of work with base building organizations through formations like the Solidarity Economy Initiative, which brings together about a dozen community organizations to develop and advance visions and practices for a just and sustainable post-capitalist world. And I guess for me, it boils down to, what we've been preparing for and what we've been doing is essentially trying to figure out how do we fight the old while we build the new at the same time. And I think in this pandemic, that's essentially what our folks are set up to do. I'll just say a little bit about the fight right now and then save, I think, my other comments on building the new for later. But right now, Center for Economic Democracy, right, we're like a node between a lot of different groups on the front lines. And just this past week, we were able to pull together something called the Mass Redistribution Fund and raised over $250,000 from people who are donating their stimulus checks to go back out to 20 relief funds that are actually being run by our community-based partners across the state. These are the folks that have been doing the organizing, doing the service. Essentially, these are the folks closest to the people and to the pain right now. So being able to do that on a quick turnaround, having the right relationships in place so that we can actually make sure these kinds of resources can go to where they're most needed. This is what we've been building over time. But I think it goes beyond that because our groups have also been in the front lines of trying to fight against the things that we think need to be changed in our system. And right now is the moment that, we can start to demand a people's bailout, right? To say, this is what public resources should be used for, to invest and help with the kinds of things, whether it's housing, healthcare, education, right? All the things that people need to actually live a dignified life. Our groups are also at the forefront of trying to cancel rent, put a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions, right? And we're actually winning some of those things. There's a long way to go before we make these things the new normal and kind of make sense in the long term. But I think in this moment, people are open to talking about these things, and we have a chance to really step in to help reframe, what would a new world look like? Because we're not going back. Going back is not an option for those folks in our communities. So I think I'll pause there with your initial question, and thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. Hoda, same question. In terms of how is your work in responding to the urgency of now, at the same time building the foundation that we need to move forward?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for organizing this and having me. I don't know if there's much left to say after this brilliant panel, and I'm excited to continue to learn from everybody here. I just want to echo, I think, everything that everyone has already been saying. I think what is really important about this moment in particular is that it has really shown a light on something that a lot of us have known and been fighting for and yelling for a very long time. And that's that we're really only as safe as our most vulnerable person. And we're only as protected as our least protected person. And I think that sometimes we say this, in pre-COVID, everyone's like, okay, yeah, we're, it's like a fun catchphrase. But now I think it's blatantly clear that that's actually very, very true. And so I think economic justice, especially in a time of COVID, we can connect to every other type of justice. As everyone has been saying, it's systems change. Economic justice is gender justice. It's racial justice. It's environmental justice. And so when we can see all of these things working together, I think that is something that this moment allows us to really sort of pull apart and interrogate. And there's a reason why co-ops are sort of exploding right now. And it's because we're realizing, or a lot of people are realizing, that these systems are not made to care for us. If they were here to care for us, then this country would not be falling apart. This is the richest country in the world. Of course, riches stolen, on the backs of slaves, and from across the rest of the world, we are an active empire. But it's still the richest country in the world. And how can this country not provide housing for everybody? How are people, how are the most number of COVID infections and death rates in this country? And I think that that's incredibly telling of the systems that we're finding ourselves in. And if we were, if we're really interested in caring for our people, then we would not have a shortage of spaces for people to live in. We wouldn't have a shortage of face masks or gloves. But if this was anything else, but instead, we have a surplus right now is bombs. We have a surplus of guns. We have a surplus of weapons of mass destruction. And I think that in and of itself is very telling about where this country prioritizes its resources. And it's not in people, it's in destruction. It's not in justice, it's in caging people and calling that justice. And so I think something that also I find very interesting whenever everyone is starting to approach the conversation about what could another world outside of capitalism look like, the first thing everyone says is, oh, that doesn't work. Oh, don't talk about that. That doesn't work. That never worked. Look around. What capitalism is not working. It doesn't make sense for people to be on the street right now. It doesn't make sense for us to not have enough face masks, that people in New York are wearing garbage bags on the front lines. How is capitalism working? So I think that there's something that's really, really telling about this moment when we see funds being directed toward weaponry, that weapons manufacturers are still open and workers are still working in factories and unable to unionize or organize. But people, our frontline people at grocery stores are just asking for basic protection and childcare, very basic things. So I think what I think is really important is that when we think about economic justice, we have to think about it within the larger context of everything that it's tied to. And that we can't even start to approach the conversation about economic justice, especially under COVID, if we're not talking about all of these other sorts of systems or issues that it's connected to. And we know that everyone can get the virus, but it doesn't affect everybody equally. In Chicago, for example, Black Chicagoans are 6 times more likely to die and have been dying at 6 times the rates of white Chicagoans. Some of the biggest sites of the spread of COVID are jails. And also Latinx communities. So when we have all of this information and we're seeing who's disproportionately affected, if we want to start the conversation about economic justice, we have to make sure that we're centering it within all of the other ongoing violences and systemic violences and state violence against the communities at large as well.
Yeah, that was well put. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to deviate slightly because each of you mentioned something that I would like you to elaborate on. And that one thing being this as a moment of both peril and crises, but an opportunity that each of you and your organizations and your communities have kind of in many ways been poised to respond to. And both the strategies, the ideas, the resources that you've been building can be extrapolated, can be used more broadly by other communities. So I think it's a really interesting tension, this idea of crises and opportunity. The challenge I have, and the challenge I'm going to offer you, is we've been talking about these things for decades. And while people's eyes are open to it differently, how do we really bring more people in? What do you think will work in the respective communities that you're working to really bring more people into this thing that we haven't even defined yet, right? None of us have actually defined what is the solidarity economy? What are these worker cooperatives? So as you're describing, how are you kind of sharing, it's essentially sharing the information that you've been cultivating for decades, I would say, among each of you. How are you going to bring people into this thing? What is this thing? I'll start with Kali and just go around again.
Good question. I think we are seeing on the practical side just a surge in folks wanting to get involved, and us struggling to figure out how to incorporate them in, with the physical distancing practices that have to be engaged. We are slowly figuring some things out, but the interest to be involved still exceeds what we feel at this point comfortable to move. And what do I mean by that? So, there are now a ton of folks who see the need for food sovereignty in the way that they didn't a couple of weeks ago in our community, and are saying, hey, I want to do some farming. And so production is ramped up significantly here, far exceeding, what we had planned to do this year, which is a good thing. But there's more people who are now seeing it, who understand it, want to get involved. We don't have enough land to make sure that, hey, folks can be 10 feet away. We have enough mass now from our own mass production kind of activities to serve the basic needs of those who are out in the field doing that type of work, but we don't have enough gloves. We don't have those type of things at hand, so it becomes a limitation. What I think it's enabled us to do, however, is to raise the points that have been raised here, is to ask people, in our organizing work, in our engagement work, we want you to think, why are we making masks? Why are we having to sew masks in this country to defend our community? When, this is something that can be made, in the millions quickly, if there was enough political will. So why are we having to do it? Why there's no distribution of these in our community, in a time of crisis? Why are our doctors and our nurses in our community struggling? Why are there no testing sites? So we are still doing, I think, the critical work that I think has to be done of engaging people politically about the moment and posing our alternatives. So we haven't posed the mass production as to be like, we want to stop doing this. It's more or less of a situation is the system already has the capacity to do this. It's not doing this because the political will doesn't exist to make it happen, to make it so, to fulfill human need. So it's like, we're going to demand what we need, but should that not come, we're going to produce what we have to in the here and now and learn how to scale up so that we can meet human need. We can meet the needs of our community. And we're having open conversations now in the way that we haven't about, we should be producing for ourselves anyway under these new terms and conditions. And because the thing that we're also trying to highlight is there's a certain flexibility in this moment of uncertainty and crisis, but also letting people know that those who do produce mass will come once things become more stabilized and try to make it illegal for us to do so after we have improved our techniques and experience of how to do it, in the process, and maybe be able to get to a point of displacing and not even being able to need them if we keep along a certain trend. So we're having a deeper conversation and dialogue, and I think a level of organizing and prep around how to build the anti-capitalist, kind of future and orientation, both in the positive and the negative of the moment. And I think where the challenge, I think, is for us, those of us who are doing this work, is to figure out in the here and now how to go to scale in ways we haven't been able to before. That's our biggest challenge. And that's why I started with the point of like, the people wanting to do stuff is greater now than it's ever been, but trying to figure out how to actually, scale up both under these conditions and the resources limitations that we have, I think is a critical piece to what's going on. But one of the things I've been trying to encourage folks to do that I want to bring some focus and attention on, there's some critical lessons in the past that I think we have to draw upon. I think we need to look at some of the organizing work in the Great Depression on many levels with a new critical lens and an eye. Because I think there are a lot of things that were tried and experimented, some of it very successful in its time and context, that we need to kind of bring back to meet the moment, but to do so with, I think, a very clear orientation not toward surviving this crisis, but displacing the capitalist system and being very open and explicit around that. So one of the things some of the things I would mention that may not be on people's minds. Number one is to look at the unemployed councils that were built during the 1930s. We now have 30 plus million newly unemployed people. And I stress the newly unemployed because there were millions of structurally unemployed already. And if we don't organize ourselves on a broad class-based, needs-based perspective, we're going to get torn apart by the forces of capital as the society either stabilizes or constructs this new, more brutal and vicious, norm that they're trying to force down our throats now. And what that will look like in reality is, the quest for $15 an hour that we've been struggling for years may be completely obsolete, as they'll have millions of desperate people, clamoring to take whatever they can get to meet, to make ends meet. If we aren't able to rise to the occasion and do the level of political organizing needed so that we can cancel the rents, cancel the mortgage, figure out how to distribute food based upon need, not based upon price or other so-called market mechanisms. And we know these things are possible because we don't have a food problem in this country. I think everybody should be clear about that. There's still enough production that's out there. We have a distribution problem here in this country. So there's tons of food that's just being literally thrown in the garbage right now that could be making it directly to families and communities if there were different means and mechanisms of distribution that didn't rely upon, grocery stores, or they were re-articulated in a different way. And these are all opportunities that we have to step into from the solidarity economy perspective to reorganize in such a way to meet the need. Okay. And we have history and examples of doing that. And the last thing I'll raise and stop is there's another set of things I want us to pay attention to is how we come out of the crisis. And what I mean by that, if you look at what happened in Argentina in 2000, 2001, there was a tremendous period of cooperative growth from plant seizures and farm seizures that happened, very spontaneous in a network that was built. It was not able to withstand and rearticulate the economy once the crisis was over. So we have to figure out how to build institutions that not only meet the needs of the crisis, but are very clear about displacing the other mechanism. And that's going to be an intense political study because it's not just like the people in Argentina lost interest. One of the major things that was used against them was that they were choked from the financing and the resources that they need to repair their capital and their equipment, so they wind up losing out. And I would argue that's where the larger political battle is going to need to be waged here. Particularly as it's the heart of finance capital on the globe. So we got some serious things that we need to look at and consider, I think, going forward. I'll stop there just in the interest of time, but my point is there are a number of different things that exist in our past that we can draw upon if we're willing to study and engage and share amongst each other to deal with this moment, that we're not bereft of tools, I think, to really engage.
That's really important. Thank you for that. I'm going to actually turn to both Hoda and Renee for this question, because I hopefully you can kind of help us think about this within the context of Chicago, right? And then I'm going to turn back to Penn. But meaning, one, what is the solidarity economy, and what does that look like in Chicago, as you understand it? And how are we, or might we, kind of deal with the duality of crisis and opportunity, or how are we doing it? I think it's happening a bit, but perhaps you can help folks here in Chicago understand this a little better. Thanks. I'll start with Renee, and then I'll go to Hoda, and then I'll come back to Penn.
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief, because I'm looking forward to Hoda's comments on this as well. So a couple of things. I think, as we talk about the solidarity economy, I mean, obviously a word that we use a lot probably in our organizing, but generally the solidarity economy is just this idea that what we really need is an economy. We need institutions, more or less, that serve the needs of people and the planet in terms of our limited resources. So thinking about ecological practices, but basically, how do we build an economy that ultimately can overtake the mainstream global neoliberal capitalism economy, right, to actually serve the needs of people, communities that we know for so long have been, exploited, left out, completely marginalized of the mainstream economy. And so what that looks like when you actually drill down and what the solidarity economy that exists everywhere, right, that exists in every single city, town in this country and manifests itself in lots of different ways. But when you drill down, I mean, really what we're talking about is community controlled or collective action around institutions that actually are responsive to the needs of people and that they directly control, right? And that contribute more or less to a better society, right? Like to human flourishment, right? In serving like our material needs, but also thinking about like the things that, the things that we want, right? So what does self-determination look like? And I think, in thinking about this crisis and opportunity, I mean, part of it is that the crisis is creating opportunity, like the necessity for so many folks who may have been hanging on just from that check to check and kind of making and getting by, now are forced to engage in mutual aid and self-help, but also to think about or maybe awoken, right, to what the failures of the system. But then I think for a lot of us, right, certainly in Black and Brown communities and Indigenous communities, we've experienced this for so long. So we've seen the ways that both government and the market or capitalism or corporations, right, have not served to meet any of our needs. I mean, growing up in Gary, Indiana, it was very evident that both government and capitalism, right, mostly centered around the steel mill in Gary, was not there to serve us in many ways. And I say that in part because of the capture of, I think, government, of capitalism, kind of overtaking democracy. So even, people have to fight for very basic things like the fight for 15, right? That's low-hanging fruit, that people should be reasonably compensated for their labor, that they should be able to feed their families, that they should be able to, access quality housing and clothe themselves and eat. Like those are very basic things. And so, but those are also things that people are still fighting for. Those are things that this system does not allow for and does not certainly emphasize. And that kind of goes back to this point of capitalism, more or less. We know who people value. We know what the system has valued, and it has not been the well-being of our people. And so, again, I think some of the crisis is creating opportunity. I'll just say maybe a few things about what I think our assets are, and maybe some of the things that we need. One of the other things that the crisis has at least opened my eyes to is, right, one of our most valuable assets is relationships. And thinking about how people have had to adjust in terms of organizing. Everybody's, we have to practice social distancing. People are staying at home right now. The people that have been most affected, obviously, are grassroots organizations who have deep relationships with their constituencies, with their neighborhoods, right? And one of the positive things, at least about Chicago, that we've seen is there's a lot of very localized neighborhood by neighborhood community organizing that happens. And it's not, there are larger organizations, but by and large, a lot of the organizing work is not centralized here in any way. And so that's of benefit to us. And also, I think, to a certain extent, a disadvantage. So it benefits us in the sense that, there are organizations that have deep relationships with people, residents, have a good sense of what they need, know where people live, like to that extent, and are checking in on folks. And so when some of the mutual aid networks started to pop up, I think that there was a natural kind of infrastructure, and some of the mutual aid that's happening in Chicago is really neighborhood by neighborhood in terms of direct cash assistance to dropping off, boxes of food, to obviously organizing rent strikes. A lot of that is happening on the neighborhood level. The disadvantage to some of this, or I think some of the work that still needs to happen, is like we need to continue building out those relationships, right? So if people aren't already tapped in, I think people are probably, you know, trying to figure out where to go. You can't just walk into somebody's, you know, storefront right now in terms of accessing services. And so trying to both continue to build relationships with folks in the community, but also build relationships amongst the grassroots organizations in ways that we can leverage our collective assets for the benefit of everyone, right? And so, you know, some of that work is happening. I really want to lift up some of the work that ColaNet Collaborative has been doing around time banking, and now they're doing some work in conjunction with the Co-op Ed Center here in Chicago for actual cooperatives just to talk to each other about what they need, right? Through time banking, right? To offer what they have to offer, and also to kind of see if there are other co-ops that might assist what they need. And then finally, I just want to make a point, like in terms of Kali was saying about how as we start to develop, right, out of this moment of crisis, these new kinds of practices, how do we sustain them, and how do we make those then the mainstream you know, institutions and ways of doing things and ways of being as we come out of this. I think we have to protect what's currently exists, right? So a lot of what we're also thinking about is like, you know, we have a decent co-op community, solidarity economy community here in Chicago, but a lot of them are in trouble, right? In the same way that other businesses and nonprofits are having a lot of financial troubles, or just in terms of sustaining them through the crisis. And so one, how do we protect them and make sure that, you know, they have what they need? And I really would love to hear more, as Penn was talking about, the Mass Distribution Fund and some of that work to really invest in those organizations and institutions that are on the ground and servicing people, because I think that's what we need to do. And then also, you know, protect them as we come out of this crisis. I think, you know, again, that's part of why some of this work has to be challenging the political system, and really trying to not only just think about how do we build alternatives, but how do we transform the political economy in ways that are going to serve us and serve people. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Renee. So Hoda, you have, you know, you're working with, and you're part of this cooperative here, and perhaps you can share with us how your cooperative is grappling with the current context, and how you're understanding both the duality of crisis and opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Renee, for talking about the citywide, because we're a little bit newer to the cooperative scene in Chicago, so we would be able to speak a little bit less to that. Yeah, Blue Tin Production is a little bit of an interesting cooperative, and Renee's our lawyer, so she knows all about it. Because I think that we didn't really start like an average cooperative. Like it wasn't like a bunch of workers coming together being like, we should start a cooperative, this makes sense, but more like just picking people, or like having like a huge test of like just immigrant and refugee communities, doing a lot of outreach, building sort of a space and being like, this is going to be a cooperative. And everyone's like, what is that? We're like, we're going to figure it out together. So it's been a lot of sort of self-education, and really just like tapping into different resources within Chicago, within the solidarity economy within Chicago, and really sort of figuring out what a structure looks like that makes sense for us, like particularly, and how can we even cater already pre-existing co-op models to something that makes sense for the members in our cooperative. So all of the members are all women, working class women of color, immigrants and refugees. And it is incredible and incredibly difficult, obviously, because what are traditional barriers to work, so lack of, for example, English skills, or needing childcare on site, difficulty with transportation, all of those we sort of prioritize as like things that we're excited about to be able to offer someone a membership, because we want to make sure that like economic justice to us looks like being able that the people who have the most disadvantage and have the most barriers to finding work are actually completely cared for and like holistically cared for. And so it's really just sitting and imagining what could it look like to have a place that provides income, but also supports you holistically. So people aren't just seen as like someone who just does labor and then like come back home, but like someone that also comes to a community space, is contributing something, is building something, imagining something, and is able to really feel comfortable just living, but also like thriving. And I think that particularly what's important for us is that I think we really are trying to like focus on like two main things. Like one, we work in the fashion industry, and supply chains are incredibly devaluing of garment workers. Garment workers are systemically silenced. Historically, they're predominantly women of color, Muslim women of color in the global South. And a lot of sweatshops also continue to exist in the United States. So garment workers and the bottom of the supply chain are really some of the most devalued, and yet they're makers, they're creators. They're literally the ones that are the most intimate process to developing the clothes that designers get to like walk around and say that they made. So for us, forming a cooperative structure was really intuitive because I don't know anything about fashion, so like I couldn't be the one to tell people what to do when everyone had so much fashion experience and like sewing and manufacturing experience. So it just made sense in that way. But also like when the people who are making the clothes get to decide every aspect of who they work with, what that space looks like, if they even want to take that project on, that's also beneficial to the work itself. It makes sense that we are creating a space that the people who are literally creating clothes get to decide whose clothes they make, how they make it, and all of the sort of aspects that really allows this agency to come back into the people who deserve it. And so for us, it's not just trying to like flip this on like an individual scale in our own like organization of being able to allow all of the members, or like have all of the members be in deciding every single aspect of the cooperative, what the space looks like, how much we make everything, but also in doing so, it actually flips the entire supply chain. We're actually prioritizing garment workers in the production of clothing rather than an afterthought, or like people even realizing that humans are not still making our clothes. So when designers come to our studio and they get to like see everything, they're being interviewed. It's not us. Like we get to ask them, okay, so what are your plans with this line? Who are you selling to? Who's your audience? How are you making this? Where's this, like, are the fabrics sustainable? So when we get that agency, it's also just incredibly powerful for everybody who also comes from a lot of histories of trauma, to be able to now to have that full agency over what your work looks like, and have the means of what you're working and what you're producing with your hands, and having a bit of agency and control over what happens to that. So we have situations where a designer will come in, the price points are amazing for us, like, will it be really great? Then she'll leave and one of her members will be like, she was so racist. We're like, all right, we will work with her. Like, it's so, it's easy. And so, but like, and that creates such a safe and also like exciting space to be in, that there's just that level of trust and communication. And one of our members, who is a domestic violence survivor, actually stopped going to therapy because she's like, the co-op is like so therapeutic because like I've been able to like really feel like I can do something, whereas historically I've been told I can't. Like I have the power, I can say what I want, I can come when I want, and like know that I'm building something. Obviously, we told her to keep therapy because it's not a replacement for therapy, but she did eventually go back to therapy because we had a lot of co-ops are also really difficult. That being said, I think that that's just really important for us in the fashion industry to be able to flip that on its head, and really place people who have been historically marginalized by the fashion industry at the very top of it. And then secondly, also, I think a priority for immigrant and refugee women in particular is because this country does a horrid job at taking care of people within its borders, and particularly immigrants and refugees who face so many barriers to work. And a lot of refugee resettlement agencies have such low barriers for what is considered success. So you'll just get somebody a job at McDonald's that doesn't even pay any, a living wage, and you have children, you're a widow. That's not a check mark. You can't like say that you've done a good job. And so it's also making sure being able to like have a cooperative with immigrant refugee women also really erases all of the white saviorism that also comes with a lot of refugee resettlement work, about like needing help and sort of this infantilization that also occurs with a lot of refugee and immigrant women, and this sort of like the sexiness of like wanting to like save refugees right now. So we're really just like cutting all of that out, because everybody is able to take care of and understand how this process should look like and should have the agency of doing so. And so it's been really difficult, but also really exciting and beautiful to have this beautiful intergenerational space. And because of it, we also are able to see successes and like benchmarks that we may not have been able to otherwise. So for example, in a full year of production of last year, we produced negligible waste and purchased zero plastic, which is unheard of in the fashion industry. It was one of the biggest pollutants in the world. And that wasn't even an intentional thing that we set out to do. We never sat down and were like, how do we not produce waste? It's just because immigrant and refugee women are in charge. So if anybody knows anything about immigrant and refugee women or women of color, they don't throw anything out. And so it wasn't even like an added, like a sit down. It wasn't like well researched to be like, how do we reduce waste? We just look back, we're like, wow, we threw nothing away after every production. And so now we're like, we are actually leading in terms of sustainability on a global scale in terms of manufacturing by virtue of who's in charge. And so I think it's really powerful, not just on like an individual or like single cooperative scale, but like how we can change and like bring conversations or make things happen that couldn't otherwise by virtue of who usually is running like production facilities.
Yeah, that's very, very powerful. Thank you. So Penn, I'm going to ask the same question more or less, except that you have a different perspective because you've worked with so many organizations in Boston area, and Boston right now is, understood, at least amongst those of us that are doing this work, as kind of an example of bringing the solidarity economy, bringing the ecosystem together in many ways, still working toward it, but very successful in many fronts. So can you help us understand how you talk about it in terms of like this just transition to the solidarity economy. And so like, what does that look like in Boston, and how can we in Chicago kind of learn from some of that work that bridges the now and the future?
Sure, thanks for asking the question, Stacey. I guess I'll borrow from some of the ways that we've been trying to conceive of the work. I think I should say first off just that I am absolutely certain that everywhere people are suffering and being oppressed, they are finding ways to act in solidarity as part of just necessity and the means to survive. And that's been true throughout human history. And I think, but that in itself doesn't mean we've created a solidarity economy. And I know that, one of the principles of solidarity economy movements that we've all been connecting into is just this idea of pluralism, right? That there's no one right way that's going to fit everywhere. And that we've all got to figure out how to do this at a very local level, but also interconnect, right, into something that as Kali said, can displace, the global capitalism that we're all understand is not working for us. And I really want to just honor what Hoda was sharing too, because those stories of individual transformation, right, through this collective process, I think is really at the heart of what we mean by doing this work. And that's, if we can replicate that time and over again, I think that's what we mean by scaling up, right? It's not saying, borrowing the capitalist version of scaling up, saying we've got to have a McDonald's or a Starbucks on every corner, right? Or that it's got to be a centrally managed, multinational solidarity corporation. But that we can find ways to do this work that actually express our solidarity for each other and figure out how we relate in ways that make that true. So in Boston, I would say, we often talk about our work in 3 dimensions, that there's a political dimension of power building. There's like an economic dimension of trying to develop some of the production capacities and businesses like co-ops and worker co-ops. But we also talk about the need to change mindsets, to shift consciousness, right? And so maybe I'll just take a quick moment to talk about each of those. On the economic front, and this is where a lot of people start, because these are more visible ways of doing business differently. We certainly have a number of folks who've been working on worker co-ops and note that worker co-ops never really they aren't really new. They have been around for a long time, but there are new efforts to get more of them to happen. And so the Cero Co-op, which is a worker-owned co-op where people wanted to build their own green jobs, developed a worker co-op to collect food waste and repurpose that into new soil and compost. But what we're realizing on the economic side is that we need more than just individual co-ops. We need to figure out how to weave them together, build an infrastructure of support so that we can, as Stacey, as you said, really help support the growth of an ecosystem. And so the Boston Ujima project, I think, is a good example of that, where this is being incubated right now out of Center for Economic Democracy, but Ujima is the idea of building a community-controlled pool of capital that will be invested through a participatory budgeting style democratic process by community members in the neighborhoods that we want to be doing our investment. And so this has been probably 5 years in the making already, but we're at a point now where the Ujima Fund now is over $2 million from over 200 investors. And we just made our first investment in the Cero Co-op, a loan to help them expand. They're developing a Green New Deal Innovation Center where they want to, instead of trucking their compost out to the suburbs, to farms, they want to be able to process those through anaerobic digestion in the city itself and develop essentially an eco-industrial park around this processing, because it creates renewable energy. And so the first investment is to try to help them to take that next step. In terms of the power building, right, we couldn't get anywhere with this without actually developing policies, right, exerting political pressure, demanding the partnership of public resources. So we've had a number of formations come out of the work that we've been involved in. One is a statewide worker cooperative coalition that's trying to figure out, how can and should the state be providing more support to worker cooperatives the same way that they provide support to other private businesses. We have a Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network that's emerged that's trying to help pull together all those community entities that are wanting to own land and figure out how to steward that for the long term to prevent displacement and gentrification, as well as to provide more land for farming. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit just about the shifting of consciousness. I mean, we've got a lot of work that we are doing that's trying to, I think, counter what Hoda was mentioning from the beginning, that sometimes you get just looks of skepticism. People are like, this can't work. They don't believe, they might want it and they agree like this would be a better way, but they don't see a way out or a pathway to what we have today, to that future. And so there's a whole lot of work we've got to do on this front. And of course, these are not all split up into buckets, right? We do this work by meeting people where they're at, helping to solve actual needs that people have, but doing that in ways that are building some of these institutions that are more democratic, just and sustainable. And in doing that, we help change people's mindsets, right, about what's possible. And, I think maybe I'll stop by just saying that I think right now we're in this moment where I think this myth of what an economy is and should be that's been perpetrated by capitalists is ready to be torn apart. And this idea that a market economy and an economy that runs on profit, that's based on extraction, exploitation, overconsumption, that this is the only way we can go forward. We know now that that's not the case and that we need something different. And even mainstream economists, I read in our Boston Globe a couple of weeks ago, there was an economist at University of Michigan who was one of Obama's advisors who said, there's no such thing as the economy, right? Basically, she said, we are a group of people who just get together and trade, right, in order to improve our well-being. And, so she's really broken it down and say, like, economy is just this construction we've made to describe the ways that we relate to each other. And, so I think there's ways to really break it down. And that's why I think, solidarity is something, it's not easy. I think you can break it down very simply to say that, this is really about us just recognizing and caring about each other because we're all in this together. And it's not just us, each other as humans, but all the living systems on Earth that sustain us. So, so at the end of the day, it's simple to say that, but it's really hard to figure out how we get from what we have today to that. And I think I'll stop there because I could keep going on and on, but I'm happy to hear more about what's going on in Chicago and Jackson.
Yeah, I think we can all keep going on, and I'm really sad to say that our time is soon to end. So the way that I'm going to try to kind of use the last few minutes is allow you to ask each other questions, if you choose. If there's something that one of you have said that somebody else wants to elaborate, please, or vice versa. If somebody has something that they want to hear a little bit more about, we can perhaps do a round of that. Because I think the final question is really about our lessons. Like, what lessons do we have to take to bring back to our communities as we go forward? So first, clarifying questions, anybody?
Well, so I guess I'm not sure if I have a question, as maybe a statement to generate some more conversation that I'd really like to hear about. So one, I think the other thing, at least for us in this work, like what it has made blatantly clear is all the ways that we are not ready, right? All the institutions that we have yet to build that we need to actually support people's like very basic needs. So when, you know, the factory closes or the truck doesn't arrive, that we can actually feed ourselves and sustain ourselves. And so I think one of the things really around this idea of community production is going to be important for you know, the future and of the solidarity economy and thinking about new ways in which we can create the things that we need locally and get them to people locally, like local distribution of it. So I really like to hear maybe Kali, his thoughts on that, because I know Cooperation Jackson has been doing different kinds of community distribution, or I'm sorry, production. And I think, you know, to the extent that others have observations about some of the ways in which we can connect the different pieces, I'd love to hear that as well.
I mean, well, number one, I mean, we kind of took a risk in even making this Fab Lab kind of investment, you know, and in my estimation, it paid off, you know, because there's a serious learning curve that comes with it, no question about that. So the investment in people, I think we thought initially was like about a year's worth of, but you're talking about like 2 years worth of training in essence, that I think folks really need to have to kind of master some of the stuff with that particular set of tools. But all the different things that we envision doing with that dimension of community production, this crisis has made bare that it is possible. The only, I think, critical limitation that we are seeing is that we still don't control the sourcing of materials. So that's another piece that we have to really figure out. But I think, you know, us really stepping up production in the farm, I think we're going to figure out ways, and I don't say that lightly, but I think we've been experimenting. I'll say this: we've been experimenting, making our own plastics the last 2 weeks, and we're figuring it out, like actually in real time, like figuring out how to do that. You know, using just different types of, you know, glucose from some of the plants and excess things that are around. So the possibility of redirecting stuff is really there, but carving out the political space to be able to do it, I think is going to be a challenge. I'll come back to that. Now, we luckily exist, in a political environment, at least in a municipal level, where, there are some safeguards, if you would, to other types of competition or intrusion. So everybody might not have that benefit. Y'all might not have that benefit in Chicago, per se, as some other places. So that's something to really look at. And then the other, kind of dynamic, since this place has fundamentally been divested in a long time ago, it's not like there's any immediate store or corporation that's saying you can't do this. So we, that infringes upon something that we're doing. So we kind of have a open space and some voids that we can fill at least in the short term to be able to do that. So I think it's something that we have to really orient. And I think that, if it's not this, what I think to me this crisis brought home is that a critical thing we need to be working in, just like in the solidarity economy, is stepping up on the productive side, right? Not just on the distribution side or the retail side, which, and to be clear with the audience, what I mean by the production side. So like us actually farming, making masks, making other type of protective gear, now starting to make, a branch into starting to look at, making clothes and things of that nature. That is critical, because if we're just like doing grocery stores and things of that nature, which are critical, but that's depending upon others producing and then getting that distribution for us. And in that end, we can't control the pricing mechanisms. So you're still subject to whatever price gouging that might go on. Like for us, we've been able to do this and give everything out for free because a tremendous amount, we put out a call, what do you call it? Crowdsourcing. It's still in the 20th century or something. So we put out a crowdsourcing appeal. And we raised about $40,000 to produce masks, that are paying people and making sure that we can do this, for free and just give it out to folks. Now that's not automatically sustainable, but I think it demonstrates, human to human need, the human to human need dimension that I think we can cultivate, in some very systemic ways that we need to look into, like how to move and distribute resources around. And this is where, on a new level, this whole experiment that we've been doing the past couple of years of kind of exploring cryptocurrencies and things of that nature, where most of that is actually bottomed out. I don't know if folks know, like that actually tanked a little bit earlier this year with the crisis, a lot of that Bitcoin, all that other stuff. But we've tapped into some other stuff where it's a means of exchanging direct value, not in the form of like coin, but I have this, you have that. So we've stepped into that, and I think it's another means of creating an alternative that's the end around, so I can share directly with you without the intervention of the state, at least in its current iteration, as it presently exists. And I think we're going to need to explore that could also be a big benefit to this, notion of community production that we're doing. So, I'm going to stop. I can rattle on a whole bunch of stuff that I think we're learning, and so much of it is like in the here and now. I feel like literally, Renee, like the past 4 weeks, I feel like I'm adding a whole nother level of gigabyte to my brain just from what we are like learning, and where and how to download all this is still not clear at this point in time, but it's definitely stuff that we want to get out and inspire folks to do. Because ultimately, what I want to be able to do and what we want to be able to do in Jackson is figure out how to do direct productive exchange of goods and services with y'all in Chicago, with y'all in Boston, right? Because we're going to have to wind up creating our own value and supply chains. I think if we're going to be able to displace the exploitative relationships that already exist in the present kind of economy and makeup, and then we can trade, based upon our own values and principles and the needs, both of our members and our communities, but also within the limits of the ecology. That's the real, I think, set of steps that we have to take and figure out in this crisis. I think we got about like 6 or 7 months to really figure this out. And I can provide a reason why, maybe in another vehicle, but I do think there's a time limit on it, just because of how the right is having to make certain moves to ensure its longevity and power. I think almost at any cost that we're gonna need to deal with.
Thank you. So before I go to general questions, the last kind of wrap-up question, does anyone else have a thought they want to share or respond to somebody else? Perhaps it'll come out of the general question again, which is really the lessons. I think you've each shared some really important context and some really important, both the theoretical and the theoretical frames that you're working with, as well as the way in which it's getting practiced on the ground. But what are the lessons that we should be kind of learning from and turning to? Both Kali mentioned some of the historical lessons that we should be learning from that still are salient, or at least elements of them. Are there other things that are really kind of motivating your work, animating the work you're doing, not just the current moment, not just the crisis, but some of the fundamental things that really animates your work that we might share across, that we might each learn from? Anything? I'll start with Hoda this time.
I think that's a great question. I think for us, our central sort of, goal or understanding, and I think this has been said a few times, is that just very clearly systems change is needed and nothing short of that. And I think that right now, or the way in which we've in this country, we've especially normalized so many things that aren't normal, that it really has put sort of a block on our ability to imagine a world in which everybody is thriving. And so I think what is super important is for us to stop thinking about reforms when we're trying to address systems that require violence in order to function. So for example, as we mentioned many times, capitalism is dying, it's been dead. And this sort of situation, this current COVID crisis has really just sort of put nails in its casket. And so I think we need to make sure, as Arundhati Roy has written, going back to normal would be the worst thing to ever happen to us, right? So I think what we have to imagine is what is the world that we really can thrive in, and centering ourselves, just sort of thinking through the ways in which all creatively everyone here has been talking about how their work is sort of envisioning and building systems that actually are caring for people as opposed to harming people that we sort of find ourselves in or normalize. And I think it's so important for us to be doing that on a local scale, but also at the same time recognize that we also have to be engaging in this in somewhat on a global scale. Because at the end of the day, we cannot, even if the entire United States was all solidarity economy, we're still an active empire. We still have so much reparations that are owed to people here and abroad. So I think that it's really important also, I just want to underline many times that we have to make sure that we're also globalizing our conversations and thinking about creative ways to do that as well, because this work exists on a global scale and has been happening around the world for centuries. So I think what can we, and I think Kali also brought in some historic examples that we can learn from, but also how can we build with people on a global scale when we're sharing the same sort of goals and ideas of what true justice or what true liberation or what true economic or racial justice could look like. So I think being able to look around us to start about this sort of imagination, but also really not allowing that to be a limitation, but sort of just the jumping point for a broader global conversation that really desperately needs to happen.
Thank you so much for that, Hoda, especially because, this has been hyper local in many ways. I know I've had those conversations in terms of the need for kind of a more global perspective with both Kali and Renee, and I'm sure that Penn is on board. And we've left that out of this conversation, so thank you for inserting it. And I think we need a whole another hour and a half to really and for more time to really delve into that. But yeah, that's something. So thank you for that. So I guess I'll turn to Penn with that in terms of the lessons or your final thoughts. What are some of the lessons that we should be carrying forward, or the folks listening should be carrying forward?
Yeah, so just want to say, first of all, just so appreciate this opportunity to hear from all of you and to interact. And I don't really have, I would say, a lesson learned. Maybe it's a lesson that I'm trying to continue to learn. But I think which is something that seems so simple, but is actually not so simple, which is just that, our relationships are what make us up. Like this idea that our relationships are important. Well, that doesn't necessarily go far enough, right? None of us could exist without the relationships that we have to other people and to all the life systems on Earth, right? This fiction of there being an individual that can exist in nature, pre-existing anything else, is simply that. It's a fiction, right? It's one that's very popular in kind of Western political philosophy, but it's actually impossible. And so therefore, if we acknowledge that at root that our very being is made up of all of our relationships, then I think that it just changes a whole lot of things. The way we do capitalism right now couldn't exist, right? If that's the way that we truly approached what it means for us to live and to be. So I think for me, there's just a lot of return to some simple things, and it's things I know that many people have been saying, practicing, doing for a long time. But I guess maybe for me the lesson is that we've got to let go of our own ideas about how to make change that adopts some of the tools that have been used to build the master's house, right? And if we can do that in relationship to each other, and figure it out together, then I think, to me, that's the only path to go. And that's at the root what I think solidarity economy is all about.
Absolutely, thank you. I just want to share a quick note. I was in Ghana not too long ago with folks from Cooperation Jackson, and Renee was there, and we were talking about a Pan-African solidarity economy. And someone stood up and shared, we were trying to describe what this is, what it could be, and someone stood up and shared, that we're making it too complicated, that it's very simple. It's family relations, essentially, right? It's the way in which families should be operating and working together, and that's how the Ghanaians that we were engaged with understood it. So I appreciate that, Penn, in terms of talking about let's keep it simple, let's understand the relationships. So I'll turn to Renee. What are some of your final thoughts on this, or lessons you want to leave folks?
Well, I think, I probably just would echo what Hoda and Penn said. I think so. Maybe two things. In terms of this idea of our relationships, I think that really is our greatest asset, right? In terms of the solidarity economy. So again, I think one of the ways in which the COVID crisis has exposed some of, again, assets and shortcomings, right, is that without relationships in this moment, it'd be very difficult to effectively organize, right? Just by fact of people not being able to physically be in space together, we have to rethink organizing in different ways. And at the center of that becomes, I think, the currency of that becomes trust. And so as we try to activate more people and bring more people in, or just by fact of more people coming in and being open to, solidarity economy as an alternative way to build a different kind of society, I think that trust really is the currency that we need, and we need to continue to build, because I think to a certain extent that gets us past, right, a lot of what we've been socialized to do and the ways in which we've been socialized to engage that actually are harmful to our communities. But also it helps to get people to believe in an alternative way, right? And building those relationships and people actually having trust with each other. I think people are much more willing to engage and actually kind of jump in to some of the work that needs to be done. The other lesson, I think, to me, again, is like around this idea of all the ways in which we're not ready. I think I generally take inspiration from all of the imagining, reimagining, the work, the organizing that people have been doing here, that are continuing to do around the solidarity economy, whether it be mutual aid or thinking about new ways to use time banking, or, you know, co-ops that are stepping up just to help community, people doing different kinds of redistribution of just money, getting money where it needs to be so people can live and get what they need. But, you know, what also was very clear pretty quickly is like all the things that we don't have, like, and when I say we, I mean solidarity economy folks, that resources that they could readily tap into. So just on a very basic level, for example, as folks were starting to organize food drives and try to get them out to folks who needed it, like logistics became a huge issue, right? We don't necessarily have folks who are doing that, or who have resources around that could actually make that happen. And so to a certain extent, the lesson has been kind of taking stock of the things that we need that we currently do not have access to, or more or less that we would have to kind of go outside of and really try to, you know, to secure in different ways that might not necessarily be desirable for different reasons. But to take stock of the things that we need to start to think about building, to actually, at the very basic level, be able to meet material needs when a crisis like this happens. I think the other thing that I'll say, and then I'm done, I think people really are awake to the fact that the government is not going to step in any meaningful way to, you know, really make sure that they're okay, right? I mean, never before has it been so clear. I mean, from the very minimal, right, cash assistance that was only provided to certain people, right, and some people who didn't necessarily need it, but to the ways in which they prioritize corporations, and even in thinking about, you know, community folks who are trying to build very micro enterprises to meet different types of needs, like very much, right, low in terms of the priority, but just people's health, right? I think people have recognized that government is not necessarily going to step in a meaningful way, right, to meet their material needs. And again, what that to me says is that this is an opportunity to really get people engaged in building the institutions that will do that and that they can control in thinking about an alternative way.
Okay, thank you. I won't try to follow that up, but I will turn to Kali and just say we have about 2 minutes. Can you just share lessons, thoughts that we can leave with today's conversation and from the work you're doing?
Drawing on our relationships, drawing on our experience, I think has been key for us. I'll reiterate again, I think many of us in our core, you know, being veterans of, you know, Hurricane Katrina has really helped us. I think in some respects, even psychologically, I know, you know, it was kind of a stark contrast initially between those who had been through something like that before and those who hadn't. We saw it in, well, I'll speak to myself. I saw it within myself more or less. I was much more patient with kind of rolling with the process and slowing things down than I was, you know, some 15 years ago, responding to that crisis. And knowing that there's kind of a flow and a process of how people kind of, I think, internalize both the grief and the systems change that they experience around them. You know, one of the things I haven't seen us talk enough about in a lot of these conversations, which we need to have deeper sets of conversations about in terms of grounding ourselves, and I mean that physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, grounding ourselves to be able to take on this work is one, the level of just trauma and psychological issues that exist in our community. That's another thing I think this crisis has brought out, that I hear a lot of people suffering. And if we don't find ways to deal with that, we can expect a lot of irrational and very kind of emotive responses, which won't necessarily lead us to make the best strategic choices. But just a lot of short-term choices, as opposed to being patient and understanding. If you need to stock up, for instance, like in some foods, well, what are the things you need, and then how do you distribute that, and then how do you evaluate, the nature of a crisis, like what is essential, what's not essential. Now leave it with this, how Trump.
Well, I guess that was that.
He did leave with that.
He did leave with that, yeah. Well, I want to thank the panelists. I think something happened to Kali's Wi-Fi, but thank you so much for joining this conversation. We could go on for hours, but unfortunately we don't have that time. But I hope we can revisit this conversation not too far future, because there's so much that we can learn from each other, I think, as we do this work. And very much like Hoda, she quoted Arundhati Roy, and I think one of the many profound things she said was that pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine a new world. And this pandemic is no different. And so I think that's the conversation that we've been having. How do we imagine this new world in a way that's both here and something that we can still create? It's not been fully created. So again, thank you, panelists, for engaging the conversation. With that, I say so long.